As usual, we try to bring you some of the most preeminent intellectuals and scholars and activists throughout the world. But today is an incredibly special day. We have two of those preeminent intellectuals in the world. Since there's so much to unpack here to educate our audience here in Pakistan and our global viewership. Of course, Professor Jacques and Dr. Akram's talks are online, but I want to make my engagement with them, quite comprehensive and to cover some of the issues and misconceptions that we have about the issue that we'll be touching. So let me just first introduce both individuals. Professor Martin Jacques is the author of the best-selling book, When China Rules the World. And that book has just spread phenomenally, and it has been widely acclaimed. And beyond that, Professor Jacques' talks, his writings, and so on has done much to almost single-handedly explain China to the rest of the world. So welcome, Professor Jacques. And we have, of course, a dear mentor of mine, one of, again, the most significant thinkers in the Islamicate world, Muslim intellectual who's engaged and whose knowledge and breadth of both the Western modernity of China, of the East, of Islamic civilization. Dr. Ijaz Akram is with us, and I think both of these individuals have studied China extensively to make this discussion an incredibly fruitful one. So welcome, Dr. Ijaz Akram.
Thank you. Thank you, Junaid.
Yes. I wanted to say that just to inform the audience that we have gotten together before as well in Malaysia, and in some ways I like to see this as a continuation of course at that point it was a trilogue with our dear friend Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, who I'm sure is here with us in spirit. So this will be a dialogue between the two distinguished scholars that we have today, and that was an incredibly fruitful one. One can find it on the internet on YouTube, although the audio quality may not be as good as this one. So this one should probably be preferred. So. There's a lot to unpack here, and therefore I won't waste too much time like I normally do in many of these interviews with our special guests. Professor Jacques, obviously, you have presented a picture of China to the world that has been largely, of course, that have engaged the work, have learned tremendously from it. But what I want to begin with is, before we come to, in some ways, the present or contemporaneous, the modern period, past 4 decades, what I'm talking about, just for our viewership here in Pakistan and globally, China, the way, what is, in your view, what are the main misperceptions about China as an historical entity, as a historical civilization, the ignorance in some ways of that in the West about this China that has suddenly arisen, but a very deep lack of awareness of what it has been over 2,000 years, over 5,000 years. So, very briefly, I mean, could you give us a sense of what China has been as a civilizational entity in the world order?
Well, I agree very much with what you say. The level of ignorance about China in the West is of Himalayan proportions. I mean, really, and it's hit a kind of trough in 2020, especially the early part of 2020 and during the Trump period, because China has been reduced to really, repeat as many times the word or the phrase Communist Party, Mao, and really Chinese history starts in 1949.
Right.
And so you get this absurd and completely ignorant picture presented of China. And it ignores the extraordinary continuities that define China. I mean, Francis Fukuyama, in his, I think it's the Political Order book, makes a good point, I think, which is that China displays greater continuity in its governance since over 2,000 years period than any other country. So it's quite impossible to understand China today without looking at China over at least 2,000 years. Let's call it 2,000 years from its unification in 211 BC. And I think the most important thing to grasp, because I don't want to talk for too long, but the most important thing to grasp is that China can only be understood in terms of a civilization, or I say a civilization state. This is quite different from the Western history. And the reason for this is because China has existed as a polity for an extremely long period of time, 2,000 years, and only began to acquire some of the characteristics of a nation state from the late 19th century, when out of weakness, it was forced in effect, to adapt to the Western norms which are then essentially European norms, of the international system. But anyone who knows China knows that I think the fundamental characteristics of China do not derive from that period. They derive from that 2,000-year period.
Absolutely.
The relationship between the state and society, very unusual concept of the family, Confucian values, the role of morality, the nature of the relationship between the people and the state. This is very, very different from the Western tradition. And yet today, although it's got different, certain different forms, really you can only understand China in this historical context. And of course, the West makes absolutely zero attempt to try and understand it, because in the Western view, everyone, as they modernize, is destined to Westernize. So ultimately, everyone is going to be, as they think, like us. So they need to understand China, because China is going to be like them when it gets its act together, is the way they look. This is profoundly misconceived. It's very ignorant, and it's also very arrogant.
But related to that, Professor Jacques, is one thing you highlight in your book, that the Chinese, the Middle Kingdom, and the Han, they had a sense of universalism within their own ethos, and a sense of kind of their own kind of superiority, just like the Europeans did, European civilization. However, you also make a distinction that they were very different in terms of their political behavior that emerged from the logic of that psychology. Could you speak about that a little bit?
You're quite right. In a sense, both Europe and China shared an important characteristic, which was that they both regarded themselves as universal. But the way they interpreted that universalism was profoundly different. The European interpretation of it was that they had some God-given right to civilize the world, that they would take civilization to the world, and that was part of the justification for the great European colonial empires. They were civilizing the uncivilized. So there was a hugely expansive notion of in Europe's notion of universalism, which by and large, of course, the Europeans like to forget these days, but it's fundamentally true. Whereas China, by contrast, the expression Middle Kingdom in a way sums it up, which is, we are actually the highest form of civilization. Of course, in those days, it was essentially a regional notion because the world, for a long period of China, was relatively unknown to them. But they regarded Chinese civilization to be, the peak expression
Yes.
of civilization, and in that sense, it was universal. But their interpretation of it was, rather than being expansionary, on the contrary, it was a kind of stay-at-home, if you like, universalism.
Right.
If we if we enjoy the most advanced and civilized kind of world, then why leave it?
Right.
What's the point of, so they never. So China has got no real tradition of expansion.
Right.
Sure, during the tributary period, it had complex relations with all sorts of principalities and territories and countries and so on, but it was not, it wasn't one of military expansion and political expansion. In fact, the two characteristics actually of China's behavior was, one, it never had basically any interest in making other political systems like its own during the tributary period or today. It has no interest. It's completely different from the United States, completely different from Europe, and completely different from the Soviet Union. And secondly, it had no, what's so interesting about China is how little it's ever been involved in a military way. It's never been conceived like this. It's the most unusual society in that sense. Japan is different, for example, apart from all the other countries I've listed. So China has to be, you have to really understand China, the specificity of China, before you can make sense of it.
Absolutely. Dr. Ijaz Akram, in terms of the historical overview, particularly it's the civilizational ethos of Chinese civilization, did you want to add something to that? If you're not frozen right now. We may have lost Dr. Ijaz Akram temporarily, but you can obviously come back to that. But I really appreciate, Professor Jacques, that historical overview, and where a deep ignorance lies, as you mentioned. The history begins for many that have some awareness from 1949 and the Communist Revolution and Mao and this and the Communist Party and so on, and without any understanding of this 2,000-year-old polity or political unit or whatever you want to call it, that has risen, that has fallen, that has risen again, and so on. Absolutely no awareness of that, and so I think that's incredibly important that you pointed out. Moving forward to the past 4 decades, what I wanted for you to very quickly tell us what explained, from you had obviously the revolution in 49. It unified the country. Of course, Mao made many mistakes and so on. What happened in 1978 till the present that explained the phenomenal rise of China and some of the accomplishments that accompanied that?
I'd just say, before answering the specific question you posed, and say that Mao and 1949 are incredibly important historical events. And although Mao's reputation has been tarnished in a way by serious errors like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and so on, Mao's historical achievement of what should we say, reunifying China, expelling the imperialist powers, reconstructing the state at the heart of Chinese society, reunifying China, were extraordinary achievements, and they were Mao provided the building blocks for everything that came afterwards. But it took really Deng Xiaoping in 1978, who his achievement, I think, was to find the way to release the possibilities, as it were, the pent-up possibilities of China's economic transformation. And it at the time, it was, the nature of it was greatly underplayed, the achievement of it, because the Western interpretation was, well, basically now they've discovered that planning doesn't work, so they're now basically Westernizing, and this is not true. This is utterly simplistic, and has only a grain of truth. I mean, what essentially, of course, what is true is that Deng learnt from the rest of the world. He did learn from the West. He learned from Japan. He learned from the Asian tigers at the time, and he understood China. And so the question was to provide a new kind of hybrid formula, if you like, hybrid proposition for China's development. And he was, he was a very bold thinker. I mean, in two senses, he fundamentally changed the way in which the philosophy of the Chinese Communist Party. One way was by until then, really, socialism had been seen in terms of planning and the state, and he introduced the notion of the market. So it was the state, planning, and the market. And this is very important, as we know, as we can see. And secondly, he redefined the way in which a socialist society like China should see itself in the world. I mean, until then, essentially, after 1917 and the tradition of the Communist Party, they exist in a kind of autarky, if you like, separate from the capitalist world. And Deng introduced the idea that no, China was part of the world. It should be part, it should have relations with the capitalist world, not just relations with the communist world. And this was very interesting because this was very self-confident, because at that time, of course, China was hugely underdeveloped compared with, say, the United States. But basically, Deng's view was, well, we're going to compete. We've got to measure ourselves against those who are most developed in the world, like the United States. So it was actually an extremely ambitious approach. But of course, at the time, 1978, China was a very poor society. 80% of the population nearly was living in the countryside. They didn't have any money to invest in anything very much. But somehow, with the new economic zones and so on, they found a way to begin the transformation of China. And it's a really remarkable story.
Yes, and you speak about, Jacques, about the level of absolute poverty that existed at that time, and how it compared in terms of GDP to the United States at that time, and where it has come to today. I mean, I'm wondering if you could kind of give some of those statistics.
Yeah, well, I mean, when Deng basically came to power, let's say, 80% of the population lived in poverty.
Wow.
And the Chinese economy was 5% of the size of the American economy.
Wow.
And now, finally, as of this year, they've taken the whole population, all those who are poor, out of poverty. They've taken over 800 million people out of poverty. And now, depending on how you measure GDP, by primary purchasing power, the Chinese economy is now 20% larger than the American economy.
Incredible.
Not measured in exchange rate terms, but China's very fast closing on the United States in those terms. I mean, I don't think there's much doubt now in most people who are sensible. Everyone knows that China has already or is going to overtake the United States.
Well, once The Economist has announced it, then one can be rest assured that yes, the Western elites have to acknowledge the where China has reached now. So, Professor Jacques, one of the things that one hears today, after this enormous, incredible, miraculous rise, as you often point out. I mean, perhaps in the history of capitalism, perhaps in the history of the world, in the miraculous development that has taken place over this period of time, and the difference between the Chinese state developing in this way, versus the many Western countries that have quote unquote developed, but developed in very different ways, based on colonialism and plunder and so on and all of that. So that this marks a very different type of development that has taken place. Again, absolutely miraculous in the period of time that has taken place. But one of the things that today, and of course, I really, since we have Professor Martin Jacques here, we really want you to respond to some of the accusations made against China today. So, particularly about the incredibly growing influence it has globally, and the investments it's making in different countries throughout the world. So the two aspects of that. One is, and we hear this in Pakistan as well by a certain class of the intelligentsia that say that, well, like in Pakistan, like in Sri Lanka, in other countries, in Africa, and so on, that this may be presenting a form of neocolonialism akin to the older forms of colonialism, on the one hand, and the second thing is that it is engulfing these countries into the now notoriously regurgitated term of the debt trap. So, in terms of these two things, how would you respond, Professor Jacques?
Well, I think the background to this is that China's obviously emerged as a extraordinary, powerful economic nation, and it's all happened very quickly, really. And originally, it was primarily based on trade, and then, of course, increasingly, China could afford to invest, not just in China, but invest overseas as well. And so, and as a measure of this importance, we should remember that ever since, I think it was just before 2009, China became the biggest source of global growth, and has been so ever since. It's big. In other words, it overtook the United States, and it's much more important than the United States in terms of its contribution to global growth.
Yeah.
So the global economy is very dependent on China for its growth. If you take China out of the equation, probably the global economy would be contracting. Yeah. The rise of China should be seen as a positive, not a negative, because it helps to raise the level of the global economy. It gives the opportunity with a growing market for other countries to grow as well. I think it's got to be seen in that kind of context, not as a problem, but as a benefit, as a public good, if you like, for the world. And the second
but these comparisons with older forms of colonialism, the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, etc. Do you think there's any merit to this logic?
Well, no, I don't really. I mean, put simply, no. I mean, the second general point I want to make is that China's completely different from the old imperial capitalist countries, Europe on the one side, Britain, so on, France, and the United States. In that I think that China's strategic conception of its relationship with the world, above all, rests on an axis between it and the developing world. That is completely different from the American view and from the British view. I mean, the British were very happy to plunder these countries, but they didn't see them as anything other than subjugated territories, adjuncts of parts of the empire. Now, China's position is that it sees this axis as not only in its own interests, it sees it as in the interests of these countries. And we can see from looking at the figures for African growth over the last 10 to 15 years that actually it coincides in important measure with the role that China has been playing in African countries, buying commodities, beginning to invest in them. Now also in lower level manufacturing and so on. And so Africa's been a major beneficiary. Now this is a huge continent, and it's the most backward continent in the world. And China has played an extremely important role in its development. And most African leaders will say this and embrace it. That's one area. I mean, the other is, if you look around China's immediate neighborhood, Southeast Asia and so on, and increasingly Central Asia, then China's made the development of the Chinese economy has been, and the partnerships that have been involved, has been extremely important, for example, to the ASEAN 10 countries in their economic development. I mean, without China, they would not be in such a good place as they are now. So I think that this argument about debt diplomacy, well, it's what you'd expect the West to say, or Americans to say. I don't give it any credence whatsoever. I mean, where the only example is that there's a port in Sri Lanka which the Chinese have a 90-year lease on. Otherwise, China doesn't own any of these places. I mean, this is completely different from colonialism. I mean, we should remember what colonialism was. I mean, colonialism was the seizure of territories on a totally illegal basis, and then require them to be, under the British Crown. And America didn't, of course, pursue that kind of strategy. But we know that America's had an exploitative relationship with, take Latin America as an example. So my starting point, that's why I started off with, China's contribution to global growth and so on, relationship with the developing world. You've got to see the situation in a completely different way, in a completely different context. China is hugely important to the future of the developing world. And by the way, I mean, the other thing I think we've got to say is that why does China have this relationship with the developing world? Because it itself is still, in many respects, important respects, a developing country. In other words, China understands the needs of these countries in a way that rich Western countries absolutely do not.
Absolutely. No, that's an excellent point. Excellent. Professor Jacques, of course, a discussion of China today cannot take place without, of course, speaking about the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. And it would be useful, I think, for our viewership to give some background on that, as well as to kind of give your own assessment of what impediments that you see potentially emerging to that very ambitious project, and what possibilities you see of, say, countries that normally, particularly within the West, have been pressurized, have aligned themselves with Washington, which is, I mean, it's pretty obvious that it's not in favor of the BRI or this type of any type of the growing Chinese influence in the world. So, your assessment of where BRI will be heading, and the enthusiasm of various nations to get on board this project. So I think that would be quite useful for our audience too.
Well, yes, okay. Well, of course, it's a hugely ambitious project, which, if I remember correctly, was originally mooted towards the end of 2012, early 2013, in two major speeches by Xi Jinping. And the idea was the concept, very Chinese concept, which was on a grand scale. How could Eurasia, the Eurasian continent, which up until that time was a term that had more or less fallen out of use, actually. How could this continent be transformed? And I think that the Chinese thinking was informed by its own transformation. If we can do it, why can't this also be done across the landmass, starting in the Asian part in particular?
Yes.
And how did we achieve it? By rapid economic growth, by investment in infrastructure, well, I think those are the main points, really. And so I think that it began to sort of snowball over a period. I think that it's not a strategy for 5 years, 10 years. I mean, I think at a minimum it only makes sense to think of it over a half century, 50-year period, or longer, because the problems are immense, and so finding a way to do it and to make it successful will be very difficult. And I mean, it's easiest in those countries which are closer to China and which have already a relationship with China. So, for example, the ASEAN countries have been strong beneficiaries from this kind of policy. Now, I mean, we should just remind ourselves that Eurasian landmass contains about over 60% of the world's population, of whom, at least in the Asian part and the Middle East, many are very poor. So it is a formidable task. But the rewards are immense, of course, because transform the Eurasian landmass is, in effect, to transform the world in the first instance.
Yes.
And anyway, typically Chinese, it's only metaphorically the Eurasian landmass, because they always include Africa in this notion of Belt and Road, and even Latin America, which is the term geographically in a pretty impressive way.
Right.
So I think that the problems are that the difficulties, I think, for the Chinese are the dangers of what should we say, wasteful investment, of sinking money into things which don't happen, and far from the Chinese, I think, seeking to rip other countries off, which is the kind of American interpretation. I think the problem is by and large the opposite to that, which is the danger that China loses a lot of money in the process. Obviously, China is major, overwhelmingly the most important funder of all this, there's no question they've lost money. I'm sure in a lot of projects. They don't issue the figures, but I'm sure they have. The criticism, well, they've ripped this country off. I've ripped that. I mean, take Malaysia as a good example of this. I mean, Mahathir complained, for example, when he came to power, that I think he even used the word colonial. But the difficulty was that the Chinese got the blame for essentially something which really was the corruption of the previous.
Precisely. Yes.
And it was him who was pocketing, the money.
Yes.
And I think this picture has existed is true of a number of different countries. So the Chinese have got absolutely nothing to gain from a bad reputation. I mean, if countries left, right, and centre were blaming China, then where is China's prestige? How is China regarded in that situation? So I think it's absolutely against the interests of China to be seen to be fleecing
absolutely
the world. That's not what Belt and Road is not an attempt to rip a load of countries off. It's an attempt to transform countries in a very positive way, in the interests of transforming the people's living standards in these countries.
Absolutely.
So I think it's extraordinarily important. I just add one point, which is I haven't mentioned Europe in this context. I mean, basically, the Western countries were Well, they were. I mean, America, from the word go, ignored it. Then it realized it was actually taking off and was going to be very important, so it started deriding it. The key West European countries, until very recently, had declined to sign up to Belt and Road. They went to the two main conferences that have taken place. Germany, France, and so on were there. Britain was represented, and so on, but they didn't sign up to it. But a year last May, the Italians signed up. The first G7 country to sign up to it. But of course, also already before this, a belt of countries across southern Europe, and Central and Eastern Europe signed up to it. So now it's 17 plus 1, Central and Eastern Europe. So virtually all the countries, if I remember correctly, all the countries in Central and Eastern Europe have signed up to it, plus Greece and Portugal. So even in Europe, they're looking to Belt and Road. And if I could just extend this point a little bit further and say that I think in the long run, Europe will slowly gravitate towards Belt and Road. Why not? For several centuries, they've looked westwards, always across the Atlantic, towards the United States. But the United States is declining, and it's increasingly less attractive as a market compared with what it used to be. And on the other hand, to their east is this enormous, population across the Eurasian landmass, the Eurasian part of it, and the Chinese market and all these other markets and so on. So I think that the gravitational pull in the long run for Europe will be extremely important. Final point is, of course, there are some missing countries in Belt and Road, and the two most important are India and Japan.
Yes, absolutely. And we often speak about India, over these past few years, and continuing to be kind of this outlier nation within generally Eurasian integration, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all of these type of organizational formations taking place within Eurasia to counterbalance that Western hegemony and to deepen multipolarity. But that's a separate story that we can go into. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Professor Jacques, is particularly for the Pakistani context, and of course, I mean, you don't have to speak about this at length, but of course, there is a very strong relationship, as you know, between Pakistan and China. For Pakistan, it is the Chinese that the Pakistanis have considered their closest, strongest ally. Whether it's the case with the Chinese, we don't know. But of course, in his book, maybe you're familiar with it, Andrew Small makes the argument that the Pakistan-China axis, the new geopolitics of Asia, that this is one of the strongest bilateral relationships in the world. Now, it's a tall claim, and it's a bit interesting how he has access to a lot of these documents over the past since 1962, and of course, the origins of that relationship pretty much emerge in their common animosity towards India. But then, of course, I mean, the relations deepen between the two countries, and of course, now we have, over the past few years, the development of the CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor. How important do you think this relationship is between China and Pakistan?
Well, I think time suggests that it's extremely important. And it has become more and more important. And in a way, the other measure of it is not just time, but also money. I mean, the Chinese are investing a great deal of money in the development of Pakistan's infrastructure and so on. And obviously, this is very advantageous to Pakistan. I'm sure you're right that India is a serious player in this calculation, not just for Pakistan, but also for China. It's interesting, I think, that China and India have never really been able to reset their relationship since the border war in 1961. They've always remained, at a distance from each other.
Yeah.
I think this is a problem for China myself. This is a huge country, which we all know, I certainly think will become more and more important. And they share a long border. I mean, it's the Himalayas, but they share a long border. I think that the relationship with Pakistan for China is a way of dealing with that problem, like a bit like a buffer, if you like.
Right.
But I hope in the longer run, China finds a way of developing a better strategic speaking, a better relationship with India, because these two countries in the longer run are going to be the two largest and most influential countries in the world.
But Professor Jacques, I want to just push you on this one. Is there something deeper in terms of a strategic value to China in Pakistan? Specifically, we're talking about the port of Gwadar, okay, in Pakistan. Now, the massive investment made in Iran. Is there a sense within the Chinese state that in preparation almost for perhaps a hot war with Washington, in which the U.S. could cripple the area around the South China Sea and the Strait of Malaccas, etc., that these are pretty essential, necessary places for energy hunger. I'm saying that, do you see that this is also a major factor in the a major factor in the relationship? Why the Chinese have this a deep relationship with Pakistan, and of course now the massive investment in Iran, precisely to have access to the Indian Ocean, to the Arabian Sea, to have that access, particularly in preparation of a potential American blockade in the Strait of Malacca, the South China Sea, etc., in which China is kind of choked there.
Well, I think that never underestimate China's capacity for long-term thinking, and it will have discussed and thought very hard about these kind of questions over a period of 50 or even 100 years' time. I mean, you can never know, but you can have scenarios. And I think the Chinese are very deep thinkers when it comes to the longer term. That doesn't mean they always get it right. They didn't see Trump coming.
Right.
And so they were on the defensive, or have been on the defensive, in my view, for most of the Trump presidency. But I think we're in new waters now. Yes, I think there is the Chinese. I mean, if you've got an economy the size of China's, if you're so dependent on energy from outside, which the Chinese are, because there once upon a time, until the early 90s, China was self-sufficient in oil, but now it's, I can't remember what the figures are, but probably about 80% of its oil supplies come from outside China. So like other East Asian countries, Japan and so on, they're pretty poor in in natural resources. So I think that they've had to think about these questions hard for over a very long historical period. I mean, I'm sure one of the reasons where they developed the relationship with Africa was, they were very short of natural resources. Where they're going to get them from, and on what basis are they going to get them, and so on. So the Chinese, I think, have thought very strongly about this. I think that the most important, when it comes to ports, I think that the Chinese are very, very interested in ports.
Right.
But the reason why they're interested in ports is not because they can be quickly transformed into naval bases. That if you are a trading nation like China is, the biggest trading nation in the world, on the verge of being the biggest importer in the world, already hugely the largest exporter in the world, then you need to safeguard your trading routes. And part of that is to secure ports in a large number of cases. If you look at a map, you can see how many ports have got a Chinese association. China either owns them or has a share in them or has a lease over them and so on. And I think this is absolutely strategic. You have to do this over a long time period to enable it to take place. And I think that contrary to Western arguments, I don't think China is planning for a hot war. I think it would. It's not ignoring the possibility that this might happen. But if you look at its military development, it's still, it is now growing at the same pace, same pace as the Chinese economy. But it's way behind the United States, except in certain technological facets. And I think its concern is, I don't think China's ever going to be a military power in the way the United States has been, with bases all over the world and, superiority in so many different aspects and so on. I think the Chinese interest in this, this period, is to defend itself. That's what the military. That's what its submarine development and so on has been about. China Sea. It's not to expand across the Pacific.
Right.
I don't think the Chinese have an interest in that.
Right. Professor Jacques, let me come back to this as perhaps the final question. So the two final questions I have for you, and of course this is within the Muslim world. This is an issue that is constantly being spoken about. Is whether there is a rise. Certainly there is in the West, but within China itself as well, a rise of Islamophobia on the one hand, and of course the condition of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Now, of course, when we hear terms of the Uyghurs being in concentration camps, etc., we can then evaluate that as being wild exaggerations, perhaps. But of course, we can also acknowledge that there are some problems that are taking place in terms of what's going on there. So, of course, with your knowledge of China, can you speak about these two things? Is that really is that a reality of both the rising Islamophobia as well as what's going on in Xinjiang?
Well, I think that the Chinese clearly have a problem in Xinjiang. It's not a new problem. It may have got more serious, but it's not a new problem. It goes back a very long time. And the problem they've got in Xinjiang, which is different from the other province or region which they've had a problem with, is namely Tibet, is that in Xinjiang there is a strong movement for separatism, and the militants are engage in terrorist activity. That's true in Tibet. So I remember, I can't remember what year it was, but 2009, 2008, 2009, when there's a pogrom if I remember correctly, in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, when over 200 people died. And I've only been to Xinjiang once. I went to Urumqi, and it was obvious they had a problem to me. I was there. I can't remember the year, 2014, 2015, something like that. because on the street corners from time to time were what I call them armored personnel vehicles, sort of armed police and so on the lookout, and it reminded me a little bit of when I went to Belfast during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, that a sort of security presence which said to me, there is a problem. On the other hand, when I was in the hotel, although there was the level of security was extremely low level, you had to put your suitcase on the screening thing yourself, and no one bothered you if you didn't. So it was a bit random, but I do think they have a serious problem, and they don't. Now, are they handling it in the right way? Now, I don't. I've not been there. I refuse to judge it on the basis of American propaganda.
Right.
But they do have a problem. Now, what do I think the problem is? I think the problem is that there is resentment amongst the Uyghur population on a number of counts. They feel that they resent the fact that a lot of Chinese have settled, and now the Uyghur represent probably a bit under half the population, or something like half the population. And secondly, there is a resentment about a lack of sufficient respect for their religion and for their culture. I do think that, and I think that, I think the same problem exists, by the way, these two problems also in Tibet. And so the population of Xinjiang, which is 1/6 of the territory of China, but mainly uninhabitable, is about 50-50, 20 million altogether, 10 million Han and 10 million Uyghur.
Right.
Do I think there's a problem in the Chinese mentality towards the Uyghur? Yeah, I do. I mean, I argued this in When China Rules the World, and also vis-a-vis Tibet, in that I think there's a lack of respect for difference. How severe is it? Well, I think it's quite. I can't make a judgment on it without really spending a serious time there. I don't believe all this stuff about concentration camps. By the way, we should always remember that the first concentration camps were set up by Britain in South Africa. That's where it comes from.
With the Boers. Yes,
I don't go along with that, but I do think that probably the Chinese have been heavy-handed in Xinjiang from time to time. Now, what is the nature of this? You see, I don't believe that, and I've changed my view somewhat on this over time. I think that race and racism, of course, exist in a certain form in China, but China has been rather different from the Western pattern of development. In the Western pattern of development with nation states and so on, race became the basis, essential basis on which nation states were formed. China was not like that. The Confucian tradition was not like that.
Yes.
China's notion of civilization was different to that. It was based on, above all, the Confucian tradition is not about race, it's about culture.
Right.
So the priority is culture, not race. And race is a secondary factor in China. Now, that doesn't mean when it comes to, there's a huge... So basically, I think that if you're talking about the Muslims across China, because remember, only a minority of the Muslim population live in Xinjiang, then I don't think the Chinese do discriminate against the Muslims. To my knowledge, I don't think they do. And the people I met, they don't complain about this. And there are many different minorities in China. I mean, China's a very peculiar place. 93% of the population regard themselves to be Han. Only 7% regard themselves to be not Han. Now,
Right.
that 93%, given the size of China and the size of the Chinese population, actually clearly come historically from many, many different races.
Right.
So China's been very successful in, the process of creating a China which is not predicated, like, for example, the United States is on race, unlike European countries have done. So
That's right.
This is a very interesting question, I think, and Xinjiang has to be seen in that kind of light. But having said that, the western regions of China, particularly Tibet and Xinjiang, came later, came as a result of the Qing War from the middle of the 17th century onwards for a period, which was some interesting books about this by Peter Perdue and so on, and so probably the attitude, and clearly the Uyghur are different, ethnically different from the majority of Chinese, whereas you can see in China huge intermixing. That is not so true when it comes to the Uyghur. Anyway, that's quite a long answer. My apologies.
Right. No. That's right. The final question I have for you, Professor Jacques. Now, you have spoken about, obviously, and it's very visible today, very palpable, the increasing tensions. Certainly, one can argue that the recklessness of the policies under the Trump administration towards China, the rhetoric deployed against China, all of that. However, at the same time, I think that you have also argued that, of course, this perception of China now, as opposed to before, as this threat, as a rival, is not only a phenomena related to Trump. In fact, you can trace it to the pivot to Asia and all these types of containment of China and so on. So, what many people are calling the new Cold War between the U.S. and China, and I know that we kind of alluded to it earlier as well. From things that I have written, that I've read, that you've written and spoken about, it is incredibly heartening to see that you have an optimistic, at times, an optimistic outlook of kind of how, if the West can understand China, if the United States can understand China, then maybe some form of cooperative model in the global order can emerge. However, others have some reservations about what the American national security state and their agenda is against China right now. So I do want you to share some of your reflections on and of course of the multiple possibilities. I mean, some of us like to think that Professor Jacques has a crystal ball because of his immense knowledge and that he can tell us. But some of the possibilities that you can see, both optimistic and slightly less optimistic, of kind of what this relationship will evolve into in the coming years, coming decades.
Yes, well, this is a big question, isn't it? I think that I'm surprised you say I've been optimistic because when I did expect Trump to win the presidential election in 2016 because I could see the big shift that was taking place in American opinion, and that it was not just a Trump phenomenon, but it was also bipartisan, and the reasons for it could not really have been more fundamental from an American position, because basically the relationship that ensued between the United States and China from around 1970 till 2016 rested on two assumptions. Firstly, that that China would never be an economic threat to China. It would to the United States. It simply China would never achieve that kind of position. And secondly, that as China developed, it would become like a Western-style society with a Western-style political system. Now, both of these assumptions, of course, have been proven to be absolutely wrong. China has indeed become an economic competitor of a formidable character to the United States. And secondly, as I argued in my book, China's never going to be like a Western-style society. It comes with completely historical and cultural roots. So the Americans are still trying to come to terms with the fact that their whole strategy for a 40-odd year period basically was misconceived, and that it has to think of China in different terms. Now it's thinking, well, China's actually a threat. That's the new position. It's a rival, and basically, from Trump's view, we've got to try and find a way of stopping it. And I think that's sort of where we've got to. And China was on the back foot, I think, in this period because it didn't expect this to happen. In fact, Wang Qishan, who's the vice president, who's a very interesting and smart guy. I mean, he said the other day that they hadn't expected this, and they hadn't expect. They thought it would happen at some point, but more like 10 years hence. So they've obviously been rethinking and recalibrating things. What's going to happen? Very, very difficult to predict, I think. I mean, first of all, there's Biden. What will happen with Biden? I think Biden will not change, would not deviate that much from Trump's position in, I think it'll be softer. I think he will try and find areas of cooperation. But the basic shift that's taken place under Trump, I think, will be continued. But the mood music will be better. He'll be more predictable, and so on. I think that the Chinese position is shifting. So whereas they were on the defensive in the period, I think the new initiative has already come from China. And the new initiative is this emphasis on dual circulation. In other words, that the priority now is attached to the development of the Chinese economy and the Chinese market. And the export markets, which have been so important to China, are still important, but are secondary is probably too strong a word, but are not dominant in the way they were previously. In other words, the emphasis is going to be much more on China's own development. And the Chinese market is, it will be soon the largest market in the world. And anyone who knows China knows it's extraordinarily dynamic, it's very competitive. It's technologically been extraordinarily rapid in its development, and so on. But that also links to something else, which is the RCEP agreement involving, if I remember correctly, 16 countries. The ASEAN 10, plus Japan, plus Korea, plus China, plus Australia, plus New Zealand. And this is based on countries which represent 1/3 of the global economy. In other words, I think we should see China increasingly laying the emphasis not only on its domestic self, but also on the region. And this is going to constitute a problem, potentially, for the West. Because having treated China so badly, now China knows that it can't really rely on the United States, hence its emphasis on self-dependency. And yet China is the source of growth, is a fundamental source of growth in the world. So, which the West has needed, and the West still needs. And you've only got to look at the state of the American economy and the European economies in this year of 2020 to see what big trouble they are in. Now, of course, the pandemic won't last forever, but they're going to take one hell of a big hit from this pandemic. So I think that, in fact, I've argued that this is the year of the great transition, 2020. Why? Because this is the year where, because China's been so extraordinarily successful in handling the pandemic, and the West has been a miserable failure, and the situation is getting worse in the West. I mean, today, as we speak, Britain has closed down for the second time.
Right.
And so
That's
the
right.
result of this, I think, is that the world will increasingly, as of this year, look to China as the global leader. Now, part of the reason, of course, is Trump. Trump put off a lot of people around the world and so on. But the other reason I'd like to emphasize here particularly is that the handling of the pandemic has been above all a test of governance, a test of governance.
Yes.
And China has come through this test, despite the disparagement of the West and abuse, with flying colors. Right. And the Western governance has failed miserably. So therefore, China is being seen in a new light, not just its economic performance, but also its governance performance. That seems to me to be something of a turning point. Now, in the longer run, I can't predict what's going to happen, but I would just mention two apparently contradictory things. First of all, America does worry me a lot because, you had Trump. The country is very seriously divided. It's very polarized. In many ways, it's very paralyzed. And Americans are very unhappy. And that unhappiness dates above all from the period since around about the turn of the century to the present. The 2008 financial crisis essentially resulted in Trump. And now we've got the pandemic.
Yes.
300,000 people and many more to come, I'm afraid, are dead. And 3,000 are dying every day. So America is not getting happier. Americans are getting more and more unhappy. They're losing their faith in the American dream. They don't really believe it anymore. So this is a very troubled country, and it's very difficult to know which way it's likely to move, which way it's likely to turn in the future. Now, my hope is that what we're going to see is that America comes to believe that it has to accept China as its equal, that it cannot any longer insist on its own primacy everywhere as well as globally, but has to come to terms with a cooperative relationship with China, that it's in its interest. Now, this would be a huge step for America to take. No, it's not just American leadership, it's individual Americans to come to terms with the idea that they're not any longer the top dogs in the world. And that would be a big shift. But that is my great hope, that these two great countries can come to terms and find a more cooperative relationship. I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. It's my first time doing this with Pakistan, and it's my great pleasure. In fact, I'm so sorry that Professor Ijaz could not join us. I'm really disappointed by that. But he knows I'm anxious to come to Pakistan. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I really enjoyed our discussion. Thank you for your very interesting questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.